Thank you. A pleasure to be here. I'll use my 10 minutes as efficient as possible to try to share with you our Emerging and Sustainable Cities initiative. This is a program of the bank. It's in its third year. It's a response of the bank to two phenomena that are impacting dramatically the quality of life of our cities. One is the phenomenon of rapid urbanization. Already Latin America is, with the figures from 2012, the most urbanized continent in the world, with 82% of our people living in cities. The 82% is an important figure, but what is more dramatic is that dynamic, is the growth. That growth has basically not allowed us to be able to plan properly for this city's growth. In terms of numbers, the population of our cities has multiplied in the last 30 years in multiples between 6 to 8. Now, the urban footprint, the square kilometers going with that population have multiplied by multiples of 12 to 16, twice the amount of the population, which means a growth that has been not only disorganized, but mostly chaotic, no? And it has been basically one of the things that makes our cities very difficult to manage. The second effect is the effect of climate change. Latin America is not a big player in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, probably responsible for 8% of the global emissions. But in terms of impact of natural disasters, we are, after East Asia, the second continent that suffers more from these phenomena, no? Mostly our people, our population is concentrated in this belt 300 kilometers up and down the equator, where these phenomena are concentrated, and also close to 2/3 of our cities are either coastal cities or cities by important riverbeds. As a response to this, the bank launched this initiative, which is in essence a technical assistance program. It's developed on the basis of a methodology that we built together with the company McKinsey back in 2010. It is a structure around 3 dimensions. Climate change and environment sustainability, where you have all your mitigation, adaptation issues, solid waste, water sanitation, renewables. A second one, which is urban sustainability, where you have all your issues of land use, urban planning, which, as you know, in the first slide that we showed has been fairly chaotic in our region, or issues of provision for public services, mobility, and connectivity, which is becoming a lot important, not just on the concept of smart cities, but also on the concept of being a growth enabler and job creation. The third dimension, not the least, is the fiscal sustainability and governance. This is particularly important in our region. Latin America has been very successful at political decentralization, and our governors and mayors are important figures in the day-to-day of the political life of a country. However, fiscal decentralization has gone at a much slower pace. This difference in velocity between political and fiscal creates lots of tensions. And in essence, it translates into municipalities that have very difficult access to financial markets and very small fiscal space capacities to allow for investments in sustainability. Our program is focused, it's targeted to this sort of arbitrary concept of emerging cities, which are intermediate cities, cities between 100,000 to 2.5 million people, depending on the size of the country, but that are growing above and beyond the national average of that country, both demographically and economically. The program is deployed into 2 very distinct stages with 2 very different final products. Stage number 1 is the development of an action plan, which is the sustainable development plan of that city. Basically follows the procedure of the methodology we developed, but through a series of analysis, diagnosis, and so on, we're able to determine or to suggest what are the 7, 8, 9 interventions that explains the bulk of the quality of life in that city. The second stage is that we believe that although the action plan is a very important document and that contributes a lot of value, the shelf life of the action plan is relatively small, unless you're able to materialize, tangibilize some of the actions that you were suggesting in such plan. So the second part is the execution, where we mobilize pre-investment and mobilize long-term financing in order to be able to execute some of these interventions. Some of the things we do is we run, in the diagnostic basic studies, we run an inventory of the gas emissions, we run a vulnerability plan, and very importantly, we're able to project the urban footprint using georeference techniques before and after. And so we run scenarios like, for instance, this one in the city of Mar del Plata, where we have the existing urban footprint. On top of this, we project what will be the urban footprint 20 years from now under an inertia scenario where basically the government does nothing, and we attach to that a calculation of what would be the cost of infrastructure, and we do the same thing for what we call an smart scenario, where basically through public policies, we're able to grow in a more compact way, increasing the density. Some of the things we learn is that a lot of our cities share the same problems, so we're expanding the basic studies to include stories in mobility, in safety, in water and sanitation, etc. Some of the two more important factors is citizen security, where it's a common in all our cities that this is a very important factor. And the second, which I think relates a lot to the essence of this conference here, is connectivity. One of the things we learn is that in our cities, or majors, the concept of smart cities is really getting a lot of traction, no? And what we are learning is that some of these intermediate cities lack the basic infrastructure, backbone infrastructure that is needed to run some of these smart applications. So we are including a sort of a quick and dirty analysis of what or assessment of what the status of the infrastructure for connectivity is today, and what would we need if we wanted to migrate later on to be able to apply smart applications. No? This is an example of an action plan for the city of Mar del Plata, the 6 prioritized areas where we're going to be helping the local government mobilize the long-term financing and the amount of pre-investment money we need and the amount of investments. One of the things we found out working with a Danish firm from Copenhagen, Gel, is that some of the quick sort of interventions, not very expensive, but that gain a lot of popular support, is the rescue of public spaces. And this is some of the things we're doing in Mar del Plata, which is already working and has created a lot of goodwill. The program has a lot of strong demand from mayors, and that was to be expected, but it's also having a strong demand in our continent from national governments. National governments are starting to look at the program as a very interesting public policy tool that allows them to actually identify, prioritize, and structure interventions, public investments in improvements of quality of life, which has a very nice sort of political sex appeal. Besides, it's done under a transversal, multidisciplinary sort of approach with an integral value that adds a lot to the solutions. We are growing through strategic partnerships. The most important is we are sort of creating this concept of a regional public good by establishing partnerships with the local development banks in the middle-income countries, which are the large markets here. We have here today Findeter, which is our partner in Colombia, in the person of Luis Fernando Alboreda, is president. And we also have here mayors from cities that are in the program in Colombia, Montería, Valle de Upar, and Pasto. We initiated this year a partnership with Caixa Económica in Brazil, and we are currently negotiating with Banobras in Mexico, the Housing Ministry in Peru, and the federal government in Argentina. We have partnerships with universities and institutions that work with us on a pilot basis in our different cities. This is the Zurich Technological Institute, and this is the Vienna Technological Institute, obviously with our donors. The program is going very well. We already have 26 cities in the program. 12 of them have already completed action plans and are now in the execution stage. The other 14 will be completing these action plans between now and middle of next year. And we already have 14 cities that are being incorporated in 2014. 2015 is the end of the first cycle of the program, where an evaluation will be made and the board will decide. And we hope to have 50 cities impacting 53 million people in our continent. These are some of the action plans that we have. This is the city of La Paz in Baja California, sort of a quick thing on the pre-investment and the interventions that have been prioritized. This is an interesting example. This is a solar power plant, and I have 1 minute, where public sector participation is expected. These are the investment needs. Infrastructure is the bulk of it, and then followed by urban redevelopment and soft investments in fiscal and governance. Very important role of private sector. We have a lot of partnerships with a lot of companies, Microsoft being one of them. They're working with us on a dashboard to be able to analyze the 150 indicators that the methodology have and be able to benchmark cities. And this is our vision, and we have learned several important lessons. Probably the most important is that adaptation costs, which would be very important in Latin America, are not embedded in any fiscal budget process. So the money is not there when the events happen. That worries us a lot. And we also learned that the most important thing to include as in the program is the mayor's leadership. The leadership of the mayor and his capacity to own the program is what we're really looking after. We have a great example here in the 3 Colombian mayors that are now with us. It's not a program that will solve all the problems in the world, but we are in the 3rd year. We're very happy with the response, and we keep on learning things new every day, every time. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm here back to make sure that you see my face all the time, okay? And beautiful presentation, beautiful project, and just an initial taste of what's coming from developing countries, emerging economies, particularly now Latin America. So our second panelist is coming from the Asian Development Bank, so we're going to see the view from the side of Asia. And Alexandra Vogl, she is an expert, a subject matter expert into urban development, really dedicated a lot of work into working in think tanks, working across Europe, in innovation, transport technologies, and now transforming Asia. Alexandra.
Thank you very much. It's good afternoon to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. In my statement in the next 10 minutes, I'd like to structure it in 3 parts. Definition of smart city, what we understand of that, the Asian urban challenges, and the urban approach of the Asian Development Bank. A city is an organism made of all citizens, and a smart cities is always about people. So we understand that it offers accessible, affordable, and adequate infrastructure and services. It's responsive to the needs and the hope of the residents who are not longer sidelined in the urban development decisions. And we see technology as an enabler and the smart people as change agents that make use of smart cities. There are several dimensions for creating a smart city, and it's always a combination of those that define the smartness of a city. So smart energy, let us think about energy efficiency, smart grids. If we are talking about smart mobility, this may provide us about solutions to reduce the number of private cars on the road. So currently we have 1 billion cars on the road, and we expect this number to double by 2050. For smart environment, let me give you an example from India, where in some regions in India, water is only available a few hours a day, and people either spend their time waiting for water or do it without it altogether. And based on data from water utility providers, apps were developed to notify people when the water has been turned on, and this is a real advantage for all the people living in this kind of regions. Smart people, we heard about that also in the morning session today. A bottom-up engagement of cities is of growing importance, especially in times of tight public budgets. Smart governments means, among others, e-government solutions, monitoring infrastructure conditions, or providing support for businesses. All these dimensions are different layers, and all these dimensions are creating a certain city pattern, defining the livability of cities. Globally, we can find many examples of smart city approaches and solutions. There are already smart city rankings, but beside building new smart cities like the U-cities in Korea, the eco-cities in Japan, we can see a huge variety of smart solutions in existing cities. Nevertheless, it's not a copy and paste effort we have to take because we really have to think about the local conditions, the people, and how we really can make sure that nobody in designing smart cities is left out of the loop. Asian urban challenges. Asia is on the move with economic growth attracting millions to its cities. And I'd like to share 5 key challenges we are talking about in ADB. First, managing the rapid urban growth. From 2010 to 2050, the urban population in Asia will double, and by then 65% of Asia's population will be urban. This is still less than in Latin America, but the speed of this growth is really immense, and it's also not comparable to other regions worldwide. The second challenge is that we have to sustain the urban areas as engines of economic growth while being environmental sustainable. Asian cities provide up to 18% of the national GDP, but they also consume 85% of the energy and generate significant environmental footprints. Air pollution, for example, is a primary cause of illness and death, and it's estimated that 65% of the world's urban air pollution mortality occurs in Asia. Less than half of the urban population is covered by proper water supply. Only about 10% of urban solid waste ends up in sanitary landfills. And effective sewage and wastewater treatment systems are missing in the majority of the cities. So in Asia, we are really talking about supporting our countries with the basic infrastructure needs. Asian cities are especially vulnerable to climate effects and climate change. As events like the recent typhoon in the Philippines showed, this kind of events will become more likely, and in a combination with the sea level rise, this will threaten more than 50% of Asia's urban residents. And this also means for us that we really have to strengthen the resilience of our countries and especially of the Asian cities. The third challenge, we have to fight poverty and emerging disparities. Asian Pacific region still remains the host of half of the world's slum population. In 2010, this amounted to more than 500 million people. These are 60% of the world's slum dwellers. Over 200 million people in Asian cities live on less than $1 a day. And many more are vulnerable to economical and also environmental shocks as we see it currently. We also need, and this is also from a bank view, a very important key challenge, we need to bridge the financial gap. The annual urban environmental infrastructure investment need in ADB's countries over the next 20 years is approximately $100 billion a year. And looking at the current annual investments, which are 40 billion, we see a gap of 60 million. And this gap is closely linked also with the fifth key challenge, which is the need to strengthen the urban governments. There is a lot of responsibility for infrastructure and basic service provision has been devolved to the local level, but this is not corresponding with the decentralization of revenue sources. So local governments have to have the challenge really to find revenue sources and to be on a sound fiscal base, and also to see how they get access to capital markets. From ADB's perspective, addressing these challenges requires new forms of engagement, new forms of finance, and the flexibility to adapt to the circumstances of each community. ADB is a AAA rated bank, and in 2012, the approved financing was $21 billion, and around 65% of this investment lending was in urban areas. Our approach for urban development is guided by our urban operational plan, promoting integrated planning and development for competitive, inclusive, and green cities. And what we need in order to really foster urban infrastructure investments, we need capacity building and incentives for cities to plan, finance, and implement needed infrastructure. And second, enabling the private sector to participate effectively in this process. This is what we call finance plus plus, finance from ADB, plus partnerships with the private sector, plus knowledge sharing activities and supporting the governments. ICT, as we are in a smart city conference, can be a game changer, while the physical connectivity still lacks. Smart cities can make urbanization more competitive, inclusive, and green by bringing together formal and informal sector, private and public sector, connecting urban cores with peripheries, and delivering services for the rich and the poor alike. As municipal budgets are tight, having local people empowered to improve their own environment with smart city applications will be critical in developing this kind of cities. In any case, don't default always to technology when problems can be solved through better policies, through better plans, or more clever designs. So technology is not the only solution. We also have to see how we really can influence the mindset of the people. And this is our kind of the challenge. Think global, be smart local, and in any case, the development of smart cities is a journey and will not be an overnight transformation for Asian cities. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Alexandra. We have from Ellis, the key word that I heard most of the time was sustainability. And from Alexandra, I see across the presentation inclusion, participation, not only from the citizens, also from the private sector. Now we're going to go with our next panelist, Victor Rico. Victor is from the Latin American Development Bank, CAF. His presentation is going to be in Spanish, so those that have the devices and need it, use it now. And Victor has a long diplomatic career, and he is part of the team that is leading in CAF their new cities initiative, also focusing in Latin America. Victor.
Thank you very much, Rafael, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this important World Congress. I'm very pleased to be in Barcelona. It's been a long time since I visited for the first time this city. And I spent 1 year of my young life here in Barcelona, enjoying this beautiful city, and it's quite amazing how this city has changed, how the city has developed for good. Congratulations for all the authorities that are in charge and that have been in charge of Barcelona. When I was in Barcelona, I also learned that there are two official languages, Català y el Español. Since my Català is quite poor, I'm going to make my presentation in Español. En primer lugar, un comercial sobre CAF. CAF, Banco de Desarrollo de América Latina, ha evolucionado de manera importante en los últimos años, en los últimos 20 años, de ser un banco circunscrito a los países andinos, fundado a fines de los años 60, ha evolucionado a convertirse en un banco latinoamericano con 18 países socios, la totalidad de los países de América del Sur, más México, países de Centroamérica, y también son países socios España y Portugal. No, what's happening with the, okay. Adicionalmente, CAF ha evolucionado mucho en el desarrollo de su cartera, de ser un banco que inicialmente tenía una cartera orientada hacia operaciones de comercio exterior, se fue expandiendo hacia operaciones de infraestructura, que hoy representan gran parte de esa cartera, pero ha avanzado también hacia el sector de saneamiento básico y agua, la parte de competitividad, apoyo al sector financiero y también una importante cartera de cooperación técnica. Hoy CAF tiene una cartera mayor a los 17.000 millones de dólares con inversiones importantes en todos los países socios. En lo que se refiere al tema de las ciudades, CAF ha invertido en la última década 4.000 millones de dólares en proyectos de ciudades. Aquí están identificadas cuáles son las principales ciudades donde está orientada esa cartera, y los sectores donde están orientados son principalmente sector de transporte, infraestructura física, energía, sector productivo, agua y saneamiento básico, educación y desarrollo social. Para CAF el tema de las ciudades es fundamental, y yo creo que no solamente por lo que señalaba el colega del BID de la creciente urbanización que tiene América Latina actualmente, sino por el hecho de que las ciudades se han convertido en un importante motor del desarrollo, pero al mismo tiempo en lugares donde la desigualdad y la pobreza adquieren niveles más altos. Entonces, trabajar en las ciudades significa atacar uno de los más importantes desafíos que tiene América Latina en este momento, como es disminuir la pobreza, que ha disminuido de manera importante en los últimos 10 años, pero también enfrentar la desigualdad. Desde nuestro punto de vista, hablar de ciudades inteligentes supone hablar en un marco de un desarrollo sostenible e inteligente. Supone planificar una visión de mediano y largo plazo, y por lo tanto no estamos solamente hablando de infraestructura, de agua y saneamiento básico, y aún menos de crecimiento urbano. Estamos hablando de recuperar y construir los espacios públicos, que los ciudadanos tengan un acceso oportuno y eficiente a los servicios públicos, que tengamos participación ciudadana, porque las ciudades también son espacios donde la democracia se manifiesta y el Estado se acerca más directamente a los ciudadanos, que tengamos productividad y empleo, sostenibilidad ambiental y seguridad ciudadana. Se trata, por tanto, de pensar con una visión de desarrollo de mediano y largo plazo, con una perspectiva sostenible y, en este caso, inteligente. Desde luego, todo ello utilizando los importantes instrumentos tecnológicos y de información que han alcanzado niveles tan altos en los últimos años y que nos permiten que las políticas públicas y las diferentes inversiones sean más eficaces y tengan un mayor impacto en los países. Como decíamos, CAF ha orientado su acción hacia las ciudades desde hace ya bastantes años. Ha invertido en los últimos años $4.000 millones y quiero compartir con ustedes un ejemplo, un programa que es muy importante, una iniciativa que se está desarrollando últimamente y que tiene que ver con el tema de ciudades con futuro. Es una iniciativa que lo que trata es de integrar operaciones con una perspectiva de mediano y largo plazo, ajustando el enfoque de las operaciones sectoriales hacia operaciones con un enfoque territorial y con beneficio multisectorial. Entonces, tradicionalmente lo que se ha buscado es, lo que hemos podido ver en las ciudades, es tener operaciones de infraestructura o en cualquier otro sector, pero que no están inscritos dentro de una visión de mediano y largo plazo y que no tienen un enfoque territorial. Tener un enfoque territorial significa tener un enfoque que tenga una visión abarcativa de todo el territorio en el que se encuentra el municipio y las distintas interrelaciones que tiene ese territorio con otros territorios vecinos. Esta iniciativa de Ciudades con Futuro no busca crear ciudades modelo, no se trata de eso, sino de lo que busca es que podamos contribuir como Banco de Desarrollo a establecer ciudades que sean vivibles, que sean ciudades donde sea grato vivir y que no sean reproductoras de pobreza y de desigualdad como ocurre actualmente. El otro programa que hemos llevado adelante hace algunos años es el programa PRAME, que es un programa de apoyo a los municipios medianos y pequeños y está orientado a mejorar la capacidad institucional de esos municipios para llevar adelante sus planes estratégicos o para ayudarlos a diseñar esos planes estratégicos. Hemos trabajado en los últimos 10 años en 50 municipios de esas dimensiones que les mencionaba y en los últimos 2 años hemos reenfocado el programa para que tenga un enfoque transformacional, es decir, que no esté limitado a establecer un diagnóstico, sino que permita enfrentar los aspectos críticos de la gestión del municipio y que por lo tanto tenga un efecto transformacional en esa su capacidad de gestión. Un ejemplo de cómo CAF ha ayudado a transformar la realidad de una ciudad importante como es la ciudad de Guayaquil es precisamente lo que hemos hecho en los últimos años en esta ciudad. En Guayaquil hemos logrado, bajo el esquema de la nueva administración pública que llevó adelante el municipio, la transformación y desarrollo de la ciudad basado en los siguientes factores: infraestructura física y social, planeación ambiental, desarrollo económico y gobernabilidad. Me quedan 2 minutos, dice Rafael, y voy a aprovechar esos 2 minutos para contarles la primera concreción de esta iniciativa de Ciudades con Futuro, que es un proyecto que va a ser puesta a consideración del próximo directorio de CAF en el 2 de diciembre próximo, que es un proyecto que se va a llevar adelante en la ciudad de Fortaleza, Brasil. Fortaleza es la capital del estado de Ceará, es una de las ciudades más importantes de la región noreste del Brasil, desde el punto de vista turístico, comercial y financiero. Es el 5º municipio más poblado de Brasil, después de Sao Paulo, Río Salvador y Brasilia. Los componentes de la operación son, en primer lugar, una política de gestión y regeneración urbana de largo plazo que incluye el acceso a los servicios básicos y el espacio público, la integración social y territorial de la ciudad, la promoción de la inversión productiva y el empleo, el mejoramiento ambiental y preservación de los recursos naturales y la seguridad ciudadana. Esos son los componentes de esta operación, que es una operación que va a tener una magnitud de alrededor de $150 millones y que nos va a permitir llevar adelante o concretar la primera intervención de esta iniciativa de Ciudades con Futuro. No está en la presentación porque, como les decía, es un programa que se va a aprobar en el próximo directorio. Recién la semana pasada fue aprobado por el Comité de Proyectos de CAF, pero estamos muy optimistas de que pueda ser aprobada por el directorio y a partir de ahí vamos a poder llevar adelante que con esta experiencia y otras que estamos trabajando con otras ciudades de la región, esta iniciativa que estamos convencidos va a ayudar a los municipios y a los países a transformar la realidad del vivir diario de los ciudadanos y ciudadanas. Muchas gracias.
Okay, Victor also brought the term of livable cities, the keyword of livable cities, and inclusion. Again, leadership. We heard Ellis talking about leadership. Alexandra talked about capacity building, and also Victor talked about institutional capacity and helping to build the capacity in the city leaders. So all of those are key elements into approaching the new initiative for cities. So now we are going to have Edward Anderson, is our fourth panelist from the World Bank. Edward is going to focus more into Africa, what he has seen in Africa, and his background is more in the innovation and technology area. So he's going to also present some challenges to the urban planners and the city leaders from the development banks in terms of how technology can help to accelerate leapfrog and how innovation and using technology can be also critical, sometimes a challenge, sometimes an opportunity. Edward.
Thank you, Rafael. Good afternoon. So as Rafael said, I'm working in the ICT sector unit of the World Bank, which is a global practice, traditionally focused on telecoms and internet infrastructure, but increasingly these years moving towards e-government and information society. So this broader view of how can we leverage technology to transform public services, competitiveness, jobs, and creativity. My particular focus is largely in Africa, but I will talk a little bit through the Africa lens, the ICT lens of urban, and my views on the smart city. So one mention before I get started is about the World Bank. We are going through a realignment of our strategy and a restructuring of the organization. So our new president has given us two very simple and clear goals: to eliminate extreme poverty by 2030, and that means to reduce the number of people living on less than $1.25 a day to 3% or less of the world population, and to boost shared prosperity, which is really to focus on growth for the bottom 40%. So we look at the smart city challenge and urbanization through this lens, but I think it's still very much a core part of the urbanization story. And you heard the other speakers say this before, that the rapid urbanization has caused profound problems in planning and addressing for public services for citizens. Now this map shows anticipated growth, and that's the growth rates that are really the trouble. Latin America is the most urbanized continent, but the future growth, when we look all the way out to 2050, is really expected to be in East Asia and West Africa. And it's the rate of this growth in places like this that are really the clients we're looking at. How do we bring about public service delivery in a way where these needs are really scaling almost exponentially in some areas? So it's a little bit a shift in our production model so that we are no longer having this linear supply, and it's problems of transport. I mean, every African city now has traffic jams, and many of these problems might have a very specific context in Africa, but they're not that different to what we see in Barcelona or Bogota when it comes to the process of how do we deal with this. So waste management, of course, water supply, sanitation, health. Really, it's about the quality of life for citizens. So with the World Bank portfolio, ICT has this duality. We have our own portfolio looking at the infrastructure of connectivity, submarine cables, fiber optic backbone infrastructure for countries, the last mile connectivity. But there's also a lot of what we call ICT for transformation across the different sectors. So this chart simply just shows all the different sectors in which we have a lot of ICT embedded. And if you look at urban development, which is by no means all of our investment in the municipal metropolitan areas, it's our urban sector, it's 70% of projects have some extent a formal ICT component. This is a local e-government, it might be a property evaluation system, an information management system, a citizen-facing web or communication system. But then we also have ICT in transport, in water, in social development, in governance. So a little bit our challenge is also looking at these different sectoral silos and how can we network together our investments to achieve more than the sum of their parts. And that's on the World Bank side. This is from the International Finance Corporation, our private sector arm. And it's just to show that the investment in Africa in particular, which is the dark bar, is increasing quite rapidly. It's up to 35% of our investment in the private sector. So the overall numbers last year, the World Bank group as a whole lent just over $50 billion US. But that's a number of organizations. So for those of you who aren't very familiar, the World Bank really has two tiers of clients. We have something called the IBRD. And these are low-interest loans guaranteed by our shareholders from the capital markets for middle-income countries. And that number was about 25 billion. And then we also have IDA, which is interest-free loans and credits. A lot of that is for our sub-Saharan clients, the low-income countries. And that number, I think, was around the 15 billion mark. And what you see here is on the private sector arm, which is also around 20 billion last year, of which about a third is going into private sector in Africa. So when we drill down a little bit more, what are we spending on the smart city? Well, we don't have a specific business line called smart city. It's really a platform. It's a multi-sectoral issue. We did a bit of an investigation in our portfolio in 2010, 2011, and we found that the urban projects, that 70% of those projects that have ICT, they were spending about $100 million in a 12-month period. This was looking at 9 months, 75 million, across 23 projects with 128 components. So it's quite broad cutting, and what is this going to? Well, traditionally, we've been investing in urban management systems, property evaluations, land use planning systems, community information systems, titling, cadastre, and of course the transportation information systems. But we have a really new paradigm emerging, which is this bottom-up consumer side of technology adoption. So we've really seen in many countries, consumers have leapfrogged governments with their capability with their phone. Even in Africa, a lot of really interesting services can be delivered just by SMS, so by simple feature phones. But the rate of adoption of smartphones is really increasing dramatically. So for most citizens in Africa, their experience of the internet is via their mobile. And this mobile revolution enables a really interesting platform. When you really think about the social revolution and the geospatial revolution combined, we can now localize, customize, and really reach the excluded at minimal additional cost. And for us, this is a bit of a reform challenge. It's no longer the product per se, but it's the process. How do we engage the bottom up and connect that to our top-down investments in national backbone infrastructure and e-government programs? And our connectivity portfolio is not going away. Our clients still want that, but what we're really looking for here is the challenge of interfacing with the citizen side. So these are some of the new emerging demands for products. A lot of open data activities that are citizen-facing. Can we liberate things like transport data of cities and engage technologists to build apps to try and manage some of the transport issues? Can we invite citizens to come and vote on project decision-making, this participatory decision-making? There's a lot of data scarcity issues we find in African cities when it comes to project prioritization. We might have a very nice investment framework and an analysis tool, but we really need that data. And a really big challenge, I think, in the urban space is all this rapid urbanization. 75% of the urban areas in sub-Saharan Africa are unplanned. We really have very little data. So those of you that might be familiar with Nairobi or Dar es Salaam, you have large districts like Kibera, which are effectively unplanned communities, slums, and we often don't even know how many people live there, how many houses, what's the household population, how many schools, churches, businesses, what is the security situation, the water connections. And they have these things, but they're all very much informal and unplanned. So the use of community-based information and community-generated data, I think, is an emerging paradigm that we want to learn how to harness. We haven't really cracked it yet, but we've started to look at things like community mapping with OpenStreetMap. And for those of you who may not be familiar, OpenStreetMap is a bit like Wikipedia, but for mapping. Editors can come in and add buildings and houses and roads. And very often the quality of OpenStreetMap is better than the quality of the formal cartographic systems. So our challenge here is not to replace entirely the government system, but how do we interface? When is it fit for purpose to go to citizen data, and when do we really need authoritative governmental public sector data? And this is part of that participatory monitoring and crowdsourcing space as well. So a little bit the summary of how I see the challenge in the smart city is we're living in a much more multipolar stakeholder ecosystem or environment here. Many more players, some of which are really more amenable to leapfrogging and hungry for it, and not necessarily waiting around for the public sector to deliver. So 21st century development is characterized by a greater degree of, you might say chaos, but we say complexity, which makes the sort of the linear approach and the very planned 10 to 15 year plan not obsolete, but needs to be a lot more adaptable. We need to work with a much flatter hierarchy, learn how do we co-create with citizens. And we've heard a lot at the Smart City Expo about co-creation methodologies and bottom-up innovation that can inform some of the top-down planning. So for us, it's very much the nexus of those two, learning how do we iterate. Traditionally, I think ICT investment in a city was perceived to be a static product. We would sprinkle a new information system, and the first version would arrive on time and would work perfectly. And of course, we're surprised when the new information platform arrives late, doesn't quite work. And of course, what we see with new information, new systems, there is a technology risk involved because it's new. But there's also a behavioral, societal challenge, and humans are much less predictable than technology. And what will they do with it? And so we're constantly seeing disruptions happen, which is a positive. The mobile money revolution, I think, is a great example. Not every country has really taken it to the same level as Kenya, but I work closely in Tanzania. My first visit to Tanzania was the beginning of 2011. They had one mobile money product. Vodacom had just a couple of thousand agents. Now they have 5 mobile money products. They're the second largest mobile money in the world. It's been in 2 years. And they have 10 times more mobile money agents than all other financial intermediaries put together. 50% of those citizens on less than $2 a day have access to mobile money services. So I'm just wrapping up. So this is, to me, an example of shifting the role of our ICT investments from being the top-down planner and really the only solution in town to being a participant in a far more fragmented and, I think, interesting ecosystem. And in order to make this more viable, I think that the second message, as well as investing in process as well as product, is we're looking at how to network those investments. We're seeing that this demand is really quite rising almost exponentially, whereas our investment is not going to increase at that rate. It is increasing linearly. However, we need to find a way where we can network our cities. Many of this growth is in cities that were really townships just 1 or 2 years ago. They paved their roads, and now they have traffic jams. Now they need to handle a population of 300,000, and only a few years ago they were under 100,000. How do these cities, which are really hungry for leapfrogging, everybody has a Gmail account now, even if their government server doesn't work, how can they enable use of the cloud? How can they enable use of open source? How can they take and customize the little bit that works for them and share the risk and share the lessons? So we've seen in our urban portfolio this notion of systems of cities, where increasingly we are working with not just 1 or 2 major capitals, but 14 second-tier or third-tier cities in the country subnationally. And this is just the idea of sharing both the costs and the learning and the idea so we can scale across cities. Because cities, whilst they all have their unique setting, they often share the same kinds of problems. Thank you very much.
Okay, so Edward is telling us that something is changing very clearly with the technology revolution, the mobile revolution particularly, and this top-down, bottom-up